it wasn't a surprise that Putin would have invaded, considering all the steps that we took to get to that point.
I agree it wasn't a surprise, but that stands apart from whether or not it was justified. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, we had independent states, which each had sovereignty. And in the case of the Ukraine, not only did it have sovereignty, it was a democratic nation at the time of the invasion.
Let's say we grant all of that, which I would never do, but even if I did, that still wouldn't justify Russia invading and stealing territory.
The reason I'm staying neutral is because both of those countries are, to me, are a bunch of snakes, and I wouldn't trust any of them on anything.
Russia was justified in invading Ukraine. Move. All right, David. And then Mr. Australia. You have 3 minutes for a conversation.
So the reason that I went from neutral to slightly is because whether we consider a justification or not, we knew what was going to happen based off of the agreements and the promises that were made by either side, like decades back. And so I don't think it was a surprise. They kind of acted like the invasion was this reckless surprise that no one saw coming, and this is like his plan for world domination, when this was written out in black and white if certain bars weren't met or if certain promises were broken, which did happen. Now, I completely disagree with the bloodshed and all of that, but I think adding some nuance to it, it wasn't a surprise that Putin would have invaded, considering all the steps that we took to get to that point.
I agree it wasn't a surprise, but that stands apart from whether or not it was justified. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, we had independent states, which each had sovereignty. And in the case of the Ukraine, not only did it have sovereignty, it was a democratic nation at the time of the invasion. And so whether or not one thinks that there is corruption in the system is also beside the point, because we could argue that about almost any system around the world. The fact is that on the date of the invasion, there was no justification, there was no good reason that could be put forth by the authorities in Russia, namely Putin, for the bloodshed that was then unleashed in what I would suggest was just his tyrannical attempt to reinvigorate what was once the Soviet Union.
Sure, yeah, I think that's a little bit of a cartoonish view of him as some kind of 1980s diehard villain. I don't think that's, even the people that completely despise Putin, they've never said that he's illogical or untrustworthy to a degree when it comes to agreements between nations. I'm not saying he's not a devious snake that assassinates people and all that, obviously. But I feel like it would lack nuance to not lay some of the responsibility at the feet of the West and NATO for what has been the last, about 20 years of broken agreements and constant amplification of military and military supplies surrounding the nation surrounding Russia. I think that's the only reason that I went slightly here, is because I feel like this conversation deserves that nuance.
This is reminiscent of the idea that because Israel has an Iron Dome, that in some way, shape or form, therefore Palestinians are justified in launching rockets in. Just because NATO puts up a whole bunch of armaments and defences around to protect itself, in no way justifies Russia invading the Ukraine, which in fact is not even a part of NATO, if that's what I'm hearing from your argument, that they were provoked in some way.
All right. Well, that was with the threat of NATO. They've said multiple times that Ukraine will join NATO, which, what does that imply? That almost implies World War III by all NATO countries having to rally around and defend Ukraine then. So
I'm going to swap in Destiny and back to Brett. I'll give you guys 2 minutes to have a conversation. Stephen, you go first.
I feel like none of these arguments are real when I hear the Russian defense. The Baltics joined NATO in 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Finland is in NATO. All of these countries border Russia, and it's fine. NATO's never attacking Russia. The idea that they invaded because of NATO just doesn't make any sense. In 2014, they took Crimea because Yanukovych was ousted, and then in 2022 they invaded to support the invasion that they'd already kind of begun in the southeast, in the Donbass. None of this had anything to do with NATO. It's just Russia's just bullying their
How was
neighbors.
Yanukovych ousted?
I mean, it was during Euromaidan.
So was there not U.S. intelligence involvement in that?
No.
And Victoria Nuland, there wasn't that leaked phone call where she literally says that we have to make sure we pick the next person?
No, she said that they'd
Ukraine?
prefer one leader over the other, but there's no evidence of involvement.
Sure. Well, I guess I would disagree with that. I think it was basically like a micro color revolution that they
That's
did.
fine, but there's absolutely zero evidence for that at all.
Well, I don't know. There's
One leaked phone call where we said we'd prefer somebody. The person we'd prefer was the opposition party, even to I think what Zelensky ended up running at. So the person we preferred didn't even get it. So it doesn't make
So okay. So then
Actually, and even if I were to grant all of that, let's say we grant all of that, which I would never do, but even if I did, that still wouldn't justify Russia invading and stealing territory.
Okay, sure. But if we're talking about the territories that were predominantly ethnically Russian, speak Russian, and they were targeting and persecuting people for speaking Russian, it was essentially an ethnic cleansing that was going on for the prior almost 8 or almost 10 years. So I think it's different when comparing Russia and Ukraine and comparing Finland or Lithuania or all of those. The history is different. The connections are different. I'm related to a lot of Ukrainians. We're essentially cousins, So it's a different conflict than it would be with any other country.
I think
we're out of time.
I don't get the last word.
I'll give you the last
Yeah,
word.
give me the last
Go ahead,
word.
I'll give you the last word.
I think Israel-Palestine is incredibly complicated. I think that Ukraine-Russia is incredibly simple. In '91, they were independent. Russia recognized their borders. There might be a lot of ethnically Russian people there, but that doesn't give Russia the right to invade them because they're not happy with what's going on there any more than it would give Mexico the right to invade Arizona or Texas because they're not happy with what we're doing
If
with
they
the
were
legal immigrants.
persecuting Spanish-speaking people.
No, even
and-
so, that wouldn't give Mexico the right to steal
all right.
territory from. And I
okay,
also
hold
disagree
on.
those are happening. But yeah,
We're going to go to you're still on neutral.
I'm on neutral because I'm not completely certain about anybody's justification, but the reason I'm staying neutral is because both of those countries to me, are a bunch of snakes, and I wouldn't trust any of them on anything.
You have one quick question to each side.
Are you on the side you're on because you're basically an anti-Putin guy?
Am I allowed to ask you where you're from? Did you say you were an immigrant earlier, or?
No, I children of immigrants, but
Okay. I'm not anti-Putin, but I'm very much pro Eastern Europe being allowed to join Western Europe and the United States working with Europe to ensure the security of Europe. I think that's worked really well for the last 80 years, ever since the end of World War II. And I would hate to see that that Europe thrown back into a period of what was preceding World War II, where they're just all at war with each other because nobody can take leadership there and keep the peace, basically.
All right, you have one question?
no, I don't really have a question.
Okay, no, that's fine.
It's not going to change any of it.
All right, that's fine.